My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of Diplomatic Immunity. As always, I'm Kelly McFarland. And this week we are going to have another episode on our 2026 Road to 250 series, where we're examining key inflection points and turning points along the development of America's foreign policy and its identity in the world. And today, I promise you, we're not going to go through 47 administrations and talk about every single president, but there's some that are more important than others. So today we're going to look at the administration of James Madison. And to help us through that is Tyson Reeder, who is an assistant professor of history at Brigham Young University. His research focuses on early American political and constitutional history, as well as the history of U.S. foreign relations. He is the author of Serpent in Eden, Foreign Meddling and Partisan Politics in James Madison's America, which came out in 2024 from Oxford University Press, and it was awarded the 2025 George Washington Prize. So Tyson, sounds like a great book, and we're happy to have you today. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you and I were talking before we started recording this, and I was talking about the fact that the first two episodes in this series were on the Revolution and Jeffersonian foreign policy, and the Revolution's got Franklin and Adams and Washington and Jefferson and Hamilton and these names everybody knows, and obviously the last episode on Thomas Jefferson's foreign policy it was all about Jefferson, but Madison is a name that fewer people might know, but also hugely important. So before we get into sort of the specific questions, who was he in like as much as you can answer in like a minute and a half. But more importantly, so how did he come into the office viewing foreign policy and America's role in the world?
Yeah, James Madison, most people would recognize him as by his nickname, the father of the U.S. Constitution. So James Madison, like Thomas Jefferson, like George Washington, is a Virginian. So he starts his political career during the Revolutionary period. He's a little bit significantly younger than Washington, a bit younger than Jefferson. And so he's part of this newer generation of revolutionaries who really came of age during the war, not so much in the run-up to the War of the 1760s. And so, like a lot of people who came of age and came into their political careers during the actual War of the Revolution, they are seeing a lot of chaos. They think under the Articles of Confederation, it looks like Congress can't prosecute the war very well. And so as we get into the 1780s and the period under the Articles of Confederation, they're convinced that the United States needs to strengthen into a more unified national government, not just a confederacy. And so that's what sparks James Madison's desire to think about constitutionalism. And foreign policy plays a major role in that. James Madison is one who is looking around. He's doing some negotiating with Spanish ambassadors, and Spain at the time has dominions right on the borders of the United States. Spain controls the Mississippi River, which is vitally important to Madison. So all of these experiences convince him that in order to withstand foreign pressure, they need to unite under a stronger foreign government and strengthen that government's ability vis-a-vis foreign powers. And so Madison really begins his political career, and his political career takes off with his assumption that the United States needs to be strengthened against foreign powers. So foreign policy is on James Madison's mind a lot throughout the 1780s into the 1790s. And so by the time he becomes Jefferson's Secretary of State, Madison has never really held a diplomatic post, and now all of a sudden he's the chief diplomat, but he has spent a lot of time thinking about foreign policy. And so he cuts his diplomatic teeth as I say, the chief diplomat of the United States as Jefferson's secretary. So his foreign policy and Jefferson's foreign policy are going to be very tied together in close ways.
Yeah, and obviously, foreign policy is going to weigh extremely heavily upon his presidency, as we'll see and talk about. But when he comes into the presidency, we're still in this time period. 1808, comes in 1809. We talked on the last episode with Frank about Jeffersonian foreign policy and talked about the Embargo Acts and things put in place in 1807. So as you noted, that's, Madison's foreign policy is going to be very similar and in line with Jefferson. So, he comes into power with this sort of carrots and sticks idea, and this notion that this economic, we can sort of get ourselves out of this because of our economic strength, but that ultimately fails. So was this more, talk a little bit about why that failed, and was this more of a issue of lack of economic power or just the lack of hard power? Where are we here in the 1809, 1810 kind of time period?
Yeah, I would say it's just a lack of power across the board. It's a lack of economic power, a lack of hard power. So yeah, when you talk about Madison and Jefferson, you have to talk about the embargo.
Mm-hmm.
So as you discussed in the last episode, the embargo of 1807 is put into place under Thomas Jefferson, but it's largely James Madison's brainchild, the embargo of 1807. This extends clear back to Madison's time as a constitutional thinker. Mm-hmm. He wants this new constitution because he thinks that if the United States unites its forces, unites its economic strength, it will have the type of economic leverage that he wants to have against foreign governments. He wants the Constitution largely because he wants to wage economic warfare against Britain. So he's the one who implements, he's kind of in charge of implementing the embargo of 1807 as the Secretary of State. He's intimately concerned with its success. It's a spectacular failure because it turns out the United States is more dependent on Britain and France than Britain and France are on the United States. That's going to spill over into Madison's presidency. He and Congress continue to try to find ways to coerce Britain and France economically. They just don't. The United States just doesn't have the economic might. And Jefferson and Madison came to power largely on the philosophy of a smaller government, and mm-hmm. certainly a smaller government in terms of its military power. They're very suspicious of standing armies and even of large navies. So the United States has no hard power to back this up either. They have no navy to speak of. Britain and France both know that the United States can't really back up its attempted economic coercion with any sort of military might. And so Britain and France are able to just play off of each other in ways that are detrimental to the United States. So, for example, Napoleon Bonaparte will agree in word to abide by the U.S. Stipulations that he promises essentially that France will respect America's neutrality, but he has no intention of keeping that word.
Right.
And so he kind of more or less tricks Madison into taking the gas off of its economic coercion against France, accelerating it against Britain, mm-hmm. and Britain is going to try to do the same thing. And so the United States is just caught in the middle of two empires that are far more powerful than it is.
Right. And I think, as I think Frank might have mentioned this, all it does is really sort of delay what ends up happening, right? Because we were trying things that aren't going to work. We don't necessarily know that at the time, but there's, to all of your points. And the power thing is especially important because I want to talk about the sort of the causes of the war of 1812 and what led us into that. This, for those of you out there listening, this was actually the first ever college lecture I gave as a grad student to a first year group of 150 students taking American formative, U.S. formative history. I was a TA, and my professor was allowing me to give my first lecture, so I did it on the causes of the War of 1812. And I remember vividly that my advisor, my PhD advisor, came and sat in the auditorium to watch the lecture, and I promptly looked up at one point during my lecture and noted that she was sleeping. So that was many of
That
you,
sounds right.
many of you in the audience may feel similar when listening to my voice. But anyways,
I should clarify, when I say that sounds right, I'm talking about the content of the War of 1812,
not listening to
not
me give
you,
a
not
lecture.
you.
Yeah. Fair enough. I appreciate the clarification. So there's a lot going on leading up to the war, right? There's a lot of things that we talk about as potential or partial causes to this, from domestic issues, northern issues, southern issues, western issues. But let's start with that power dynamic. And some of that is on the Atlantic Ocean. Some of that is in the Northwest, and dealing with the Brits writ large. But let's focus on that first and sort of talk about these issues of impressment and other things that the British were doing at this point that were, getting people angling to declare for war. Because a lot of different factions in the U.S. end up wanting to declare war, but not for all the same reasons. So let's start there.
Right. And the War of 1812 was so difficult. The reason I say that it might be easy to fall asleep during the content is it's such a hard war to wrap your head around.
Right.
It's hard to pinpoint a specific cause, like you say, and everybody has their own causes for the war. And the United States almost just sort of accidentally stumbles into a war with Britain. So essentially what this is going to come down to is the United States being intimately concerned about its own sovereignty. As a young nation, it wants to declare not only its independence, but its sovereignty from European powers. So when Britain and France are fighting, Britain needs a fighting force, and largely it needs about 150,000 sailors to man its nearly 1,000 ship navy. And so it turns to, as many governments do, to conscription. And the British form of conscription is incredibly brutal. It's not like you get a draft card and your number is called or something like that. British conscription at the time looks like a bunch of British sailors landing in an English town, walking into the nearest tavern and starting to tie people up, throw them onto ships and say, thank you for your service, for serving in the Royal Navy. So they start stopping American ships to look for British subjects. And you may be wondering, how do they tell the difference at this time between an American and a British subject? And the answer is they can't. And so essentially this comes down to sailors boarding ships, somebody pointing out and saying, hey, that guy, I know that guy, he's a British subject. The other problem that's going to result from, or the other issue that's going to lead to this problem is Americans subscribe to a notion of naturalization. You can become a U.S. citizen. Britons subscribe to the idea of perpetual allegiance. Once a British subject, always a British subject. So a person from Britain becomes a naturalized U.S. citizen. The United States says, you just pressed a U.S. citizen into the service. And Britain says, no, we pressed a British subject into our service. So all of these things are going to cause the United States, especially the Madison administration, this is going to be one of their main concerns. It's really the main reason that even though they have issues with both Britain and France, the Madison administration sees Britain as the greater sinners of the two.
Right.
Is this issue of impressment. France just doesn't have a navy near the size of Britain, so it's not doing these same types of things. So that's the Madison administration's main official line. Like you said, though, other people have other issues at stake. One of the major pushes to war comes from a desire to invade and annex Canada, for example. And so there's a strong wing of people who are pushing for war so that they can accomplish that. It's something they've wanted to do since the Revolutionary period. Britain has a confederacy. It's formed a confederacy with Native American nations in the Old Northwest, kind of what we'd now call the Ohio Valley, and so that has Americans concerned, and there's some expansionist push there that Americans want to be the sole masters of the Ohio River Valley. And as long as Britain has this confederacy with Native Americans in the region, that's going to be difficult. So all of these things are going to build a confluence, and it becomes really hard to pinpoint any single factor what this war is about.
And you noted the Northwest and stuff, but there's also other westward expansion and even southern expansion that play into this as well. And what's sort of driving this expansion? Is it, trying to expand slavery per se, or both, with trying to find new farmland and get people out there? And what were the things blocking that would then lead them to push for war?
Yeah. So as you might imagine, it's a little bit of an all of the above in terms of why Americans are wanting to expand. What I focus on in my research, though, is I think American expansion for the Madison administration is by and large a national security issue. For the Madison administration and for Americans who think in the same terms as Madison, they feel surrounded by foreign powers that are richer, bigger, stronger, more aggressive than the United States. And so even when the Jefferson administration acquires the Louisiana Territory, Madison and Jefferson and James Monroe, they all kind of think that territory might in the future become a different nation, peopled by friends, peopled by former Americans. But it's not necessarily about expanding the borders of the United States. It's about getting unfriendly empires away from your borders. So I think for the Madison administration, it's first and foremost national security. And that continues into Madison's administration, this concern of national security. So the Madison administration expands into what they called West Florida. This would be the southern regions of Alabama and Mississippi now. But they expand into West Florida and essentially take West Florida by force from Spain. Madison justified that on the grounds of national security, that Spain wasn't able to control this region very well, and if Spain couldn't control it, then Britain would probably step in, and so the Madison administration wanted to preempt that. I think a lot of historians question the sincerity of those claims and see it more just as trying to expand slavery. I think the research I've done, I think the Madison administration is very sincerely concerned about the national security implications of all of this.
Interesting. I'm just thinking of the justification of doing something for that purpose, sort of, a decade or more before the Monroe Doctrine, and sort of taking it because they can't control it, but they don't want another foreign power coming in to take it. That's interesting. So one question I have also is, we noted, and you noted the heavy role Madison plays in the Constitution, and the then becomes president. So how does he find, trying to conduct a war as president, being sort of confined by the document that he did much to write?
Yeah. I think that the Constitution did a lot to expand his power. So now Madison is commander in chief, right? As the president. The United States can raise and support an army and a military, all in ways easier than it could have under the Articles of Confederation. So in some ways, the Constitution expands Madison's ability to fight the war, where Madison, I think, straps himself in, where he sort of limits himself is with his governing philosophy. So as I mentioned, Madison has spent the last decade with Jefferson convinced that the United States doesn't need to become a military power, and that it will be bad for the United States to become a military power. So there's a nation that has very low taxes and has become very adverse to hiring taxes to fight a war, very adverse to a large any standing army during peacetime, but also skeptical of a large army, period. The Navy shrinks during the Jefferson administration. And so Madison has sort of boxed himself in more with his governing philosophy than I think the Constitution itself. If anything, the Constitution is something of a saving grace that allows the war to be prosecuted more effectively than it would have been under, let's say, the Articles of Confederation.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the war itself, how did that war go? I mean, on land, not so great. Shout out to my Northeastern Ohio roots, but up in Lake Erie, we did some good things, but
Right.
Here in the Washington metro area, not so good.
Right.
And how did, again, much like when we talked about the revolution, we get lucky, right? Because we're conducting this war when Britain's got a whole lot of other things going on.
Right. Yeah, so during the American Revolution, the United States does not win the American Revolution without France.
Right.
Now, the United States and France are fighting Britain, but they're not fighting Britain together. They're not fighting Britain as allies. But the United States does have this advantage that Britain is distracted by the much more important power of France and Napoleon across Europe. So even with that distraction, the war is up and down at best for the United States during the beginning stages. Some impressive victories, mostly on sea, some on land. Pretty early on, though, the United States has started to lose more land along the northern border than it's gained. And so the war is being prosecuted in fits and starts, we'll say. And then Britain defeats Napoleon on the continent in 1814.
Right.
So it's no coincidence that it's only months after Britain defeats Napoleon that Britain marches onto Washington, D.C., burns it, kind of sends a message that Britain can start kicking the United States around at will if it would like. So the United States, with the burning of the capital, the United States becomes eager to sue for peace. They're fortunate. The United States is fortunate in that Britain would also just rather end the war and try to enhance its economic coercion over the United States rather than like regain the United States as some sort of colony. So both by late 1814, both powers are ready to just call it a war, end the thing. With Napoleon gone, all the reasons they were fighting in the first place just go up in smoke. They evaporate.
Exactly.
So this is another reason why the War of 1812 is so hard for us to wrap our heads around, because they agree to the status quo antebellum, meaning the way things were before the war. And if you go back to the way things were before the war, you have to ask, what did you just spend the last 2.5 years fighting about? But it's essentially because without Napoleon in the picture, all the reasons they were fighting go away. It's a hard war to wrap our heads around, but it's a very important war in terms of how the United States sees itself.
You mentioned the status quo antebellum, but there was treaties and diplomacy going on after the war. So, so what did we sign? What was that then? Was it basically just everything reverts to it was, or did we clear up some of the bases issues or fisheries issues, or, were there certain things that weren't addressed or were supposed to
Right.
be done after the Treaty of Paris that are now actually going to happen? I mean, I know obviously impressment is no longer an issue, right? Because they're not
Right.
trying to get sailors to fight Napoleon. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, around the fringes, yes, there were some lingering issues, like you said, around fisheries, and when we say fisheries, to us, when we think of the American Revolution, most people don't think of fisheries, but
right,
fisheries were a big deal at the time.
exactly.
What do
Yeah,
New Englanders? Where do New Englanders get to fish on the shores of British Canada and so forth? So yeah, it's a big deal. Some of those issues around the edges are clarified between Britain and Canada. But the main issue, the issue that the Madison administration says takes them into war, impressment, that I mean, it goes away because Britain, like you say, doesn't need to impress sailors or doesn't need to press sailors into the Navy anymore. But Britain never reneges its right to be able to press stop U.S. ships and press British sailors into the Royal Navy. So yeah, I mean, a lot of the major issues just remain unresolved, or they go back to the way that things were before the war. You've captured this land, we've captured this land. We're just going to kind of
yeah,
swap back to the way things were. Um, but the really important thing that happens for the United States during the war that the treaties don't really need to address are the defeat of Native American nations, Native American allies, because that's going to open the Southeast and the Northwest to American expansion in ways that they couldn't have when those Native American nations had allied with Britain.
right.
By breaking that confederacy, that's going to become really important to future U.S. history.
And speaking of U.S. history, the future of post Madison, this is back in the time frame where Secretary of State was basically like president in waiting, right?
Mhm.
So
Right.
Monroe, who's the next president, is Madison Secretary of State. So how much of this period and the thinking of Madison and Monroe as Secretary of State, how much of that carries over into the next 8
Right.
years of Monroe?
Yeah, when with the end of the War of 1812, so at best Americans eke out a draw in the War of 1812. But they celebrate it like a victory. Part of this has to do with the messaging of the war. And so when you convince yourself or other Americans that this is really a second war for independence, even though
Mhm.
Britain really had no interest, like I said, in
Right.
recolonizing the United States. But if you've convinced yourself that this is a second war for independence and you finish the war and you're still independent, well, you've won the war. And so Americans celebrate this as a victory. They have a very strong sense after the war of their own power in the Western Hemisphere. Monroe was a part of that. And so, yeah, Monroe, during the Monroe administration, the United States will see itself as the master of the Americas, as the main power in the Americas.
Mhm.
And yeah, we get glimpses of that. I feel like you mentioned earlier with expansion into Florida, that this becomes an idea. We need to protect this against European colonization, and therefore we're going to start to assert our power in the American hemisphere. There's still not a terribly large amount of power to speak of in terms of really hard power that the United States can wield, but they are starting to get a new sense of their of their strength as a growing nation.
Yeah, and it's I like to end on, especially when we're dealing with these history episodes, sort of what are some interesting things or takeaways, or obviously all of this is important for today because it went the way it went, and that's how the country then moved forward and how we've gotten to where we are today. But what your book talks about foreign meddling and domestic politics and partisan politics, and I know this was a somewhat forgotten, right? I mean, you and I might not have forgotten it, but we're U.S. historians, so it's we're different beasts. But for the broad public, like there was some serious partisanship at this time, and the Federalist Party was, the party of Hamilton and Adams in Washington was fading away during this time period. But there were still some strong attempts to, demonstrate their power or their will during the Madison administration. So what are some interesting tidbits from your book about this period on sort of the domestic partisan state of what's going on and how it was tied to the foreign relations of the day?
Yeah. So I look at a kind of a destructive cycle for the United States in which foreign powers, Britain, France, Spain, others, some of these large foreign powers will meddle in U.S. politics. And that is going to exacerbate American politics because both sides, both partisan sides, are convinced that their political opponents are colluding with a foreign enemy. And that's going to exacerbate the partisan divide, and that just creates more space for these larger powers to meddle in U.S. politics, and so on the cycle goes. And so it's going to be largely that cycle that does ultimately land the United States in the War of 1812, that the Madison administration is convinced that if it wants to break this cycle of Britain's foreign meddling and Federalist collusion, that they need to go to war with Britain. So this cycle lands the United States in a war that ultimately is going to get their capital burnt to the ground.
Right.
And except on a whim of a State Department clerk who packed up the Declaration, the Constitution, Washington's resignation letter from the military, his famous letter resigning his military commission. All of those documents, the founding charters, are really just saved from the fires on a whim of a State Department clerk who packed them up just in case. So maybe it was a fitting metaphor that this destructive cycle of foreign meddling and partisan politics almost left the founding charters in ashes. And so I take two things from that. First, we can take caution from the Republic's near catastrophe, that this cycle led to almost such a disastrous outcome. And at the same time, I think we can take some heart from the Republic's resiliency, that it did make it through this period, and it made it through with stronger institutions than when it began.
Yeah. Well, that optimism is a good place to stop. I like that. We like to, well, oftentimes we joke on the other version of this podcast that when we talk about current foreign policy, that we're just the bringers of horrible news on a weekly basis. So we'll end on that optimism. So Tyson, again, I can't thank you enough, and I really appreciate it. So thanks for the time.
Thank you.